Thanks for staying with us. Now, switching gears to Russia, where President Vladimir Putin's plans to claim 4 Ukrainian regions as part of Russia is not going down well with the United Nations, which of course includes Africa. In September, Russia held a referendum in eastern Ukraine where it claimed that the peoples of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson had voted to become part of Russia. 26 African countries have voted in favor of a UN resolution rejecting Moscow's move, which the UN describes as an illegal annexation. 19 countries abstained, including Eritrea, which had previously voted to reject a UN resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia's perceived allies, including Mali, the Central African Republic, Ethiopia, Republic of Congo, South Africa, Sudan, Uganda, and Zimbabwe, are also among other African countries that abstained. In total, 143 out of 193 countries stood united in condemnation of Putin's illegal attempts to annex 4 regions of Ukraine, while 5 voted against it and 35 abstained from voting. Now, joining us to discuss all this, we have Vardon, is a humanist, an African affairs commentator and a corporate midwife. We also have Ambrose Igboke, he's a public affairs analyst. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on the conversation.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Pleasure
Good
to be
evening.
here.
So I'll begin with you, Ambrose. What do you make of the general vote condemning Russia's annexation of 4 regions from Ukraine? And what exactly does this annexation imply?
The United Nations has just become a window shop. The vote was, for me, it was a laughing matter because it didn't matter, because there is nothing they can do to Russia. Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. So most of these votes are just for show. If the United Nations cannot actually sanction Russia, because Russia will veto it. So these are just dress windows, they're just diplomatic moves and niceties. The Western media made us believe that Russia has been isolated totally, but from what the voting pattern went yesterday, we still found out that Russia has staunch allies, and within those allies that are abstained, for example, China abstained, which means that out of the 5 members of the permanent, that have permanent seats in the Security Council, 2 of them are not against Russia. That is Russia itself and China. And then India has a nuclear, is a nuclear country, so it's also abstained. So this goes to show that Russia knows its might. Russia is doing what it's doing because it knows that United Nations cannot do anything to it in terms of use of military force or use of United Nations cohesion of military might to stop it. And that is why they had the audacity for the second time in a period of 10 years to invade another country. And so this made me remember the lyrics of the late fella Nicola Kuti that rated United Nations low. He called it disunited United Nations because he said 1 veto vote is equal to 42 cannot actually be a proper way to run a United Nations. And it has been proven right. Where a country will just wake up and invade another country, it has happened. It has happened in many other places: Cuba, Vietnam, Panama, Iraq, Libya, Syria. It kept on happening. We had the one that happened in Georgia the other day, Crimea. Now it is happening again in Ukraine. So if it seems United Nations have not been able to control its own, especially the vanguards, those permanent members are called the vanguards of the police of the world. Because if you look at the history, 1948 when United Nations was formed, it is mostly those who invade other countries or who try to cause problems or go to war with other countries are mostly members of the permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations. Okay. And so that goes to say that we are just in a charade. You know, we have not been really able to commit to world peace because if one member, if 100 members or 190 members of the United Nations vote for a resolution, and one member of the permanent members, 5 permanent members says no and vetoes it, then it will not stand.
Okay. All right, Ambrose, just hold on that thought there. I'd like to bring in Max. Hold on that thought there. Now, you talk about 143 countries who stood in support of the United Nations. Let's bring in African countries. Max, I'm throwing this question to you. Now, African countries have been fighting for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Now, Ambrose talked about the veto power that Russia has, but yet no move has been made on giving African nations a permanent seat. Now, how significant or important were the votes of African countries at the UN General Assembly?
Well, I think, as Ambrose has explained, the fact that there are permanent members with a veto basically means that what's going on is not intended to make any significant change, except that we have to understand that these processes where they are canvassing for votes, as it were, is really a way of influencing public opinion. And when you get proposals like this, resolutions being put to the UN for the world to vote on, we have to ask ourselves, what is it they are planning that they need public endorsement for? You see, what this suggests to me is that the US, NATO, the globalists are planning something, and they need a scapegoat, and or they need some justification for doing whatever it is they are planning to do. So for me, it is ominous in the sense that the vote by itself means nothing, but it does send a signal to the world that Russia is the bogeyman, and if anything happens untoward, then Russia is to blame. So they're looking for a scapegoat and they're looking for an excuse. So what we need to ask ourselves is, what is it that they have in mind? You know, the annexation of these 4 territories, follows an agreement 8 years ago in 2014, when these 4 territories, which are largely peopled by Russian-speaking populations, were agitating for greater independence and so on. There was an agreement made in 2014 that there would be a referendum for them to decide whether they wanted to join Russia or they wanted to stay in Ukraine. The West then engineered regime change in Ukraine, and that referendum was never done. And somehow, in the narrative coming up to this referendum that Putin organized, that fact has been forgotten, and nobody has mentioned it. You know, a little known fact also is that as far back as March this year, after the invasion started, Zelensky indicated he was willing to sit down and negotiate with Putin for a settlement. Putin made it very clear right from the outset. It wasn't an invasion of Ukraine. He wasn't interested in taking over Ukraine. It was a limited military operation, essentially to liberate these Russian-speaking regions that were being terrorized by the Ukraine government. And we forget that the Ukraine government was waging war on these territories. So that was the limited objective that Putin set out to do. And Zelensky was ready to negotiate a settlement in March 2022 until Boris Johnson flew into Kiev and somehow persuaded Zelensky that no, the West and NATO would be right behind him. If he kept on fighting, he'll be given NATO membership, so he should keep on fighting and forget the settlement. And none of this is being reported in the Western press because there's a greater agenda that is going on, where it seems to me that there are people who are much more interested in prolonging this conflict and perhaps leading us to nuclear Armageddon than suing for peace.
Okay, now going by this ulterior motive and this agenda to prolong the conflict, I think a South African representative also talked about the fact that more emphasis should be on ending this conflict. Now, Ambrose, African countries have somehow been put in the middle of this, and we had about 19 countries who abstained from it. So would you refer to it as a major division among the stands of African countries, or would you say that let African countries just leave the European powers with their ulterior motives and, just deal with African issues?
Yeah. This question, you are putting me in the position of African countries.
I mean, you're in Africa, you're Nigerian. I'm sure there are a lot of issues affecting you.
The African countries themselves, have just been pawns, in the chess game, in the diplomatic chess games that have been going on in the world. Gone are the days when African countries had very strong stance when it concerns diplomatic alignments, international diplomatic alignments. We saw that flash of, very solid diplomatic alliance in the 70s during the Muritala Obasanjo regime, when the regime of Muritala Mohammed Obasanjo regime aligned towards the Soviet bloc. That time, we call it the Eastern Bloc. And that is where you saw a lot of Russian. That is where, for example, National Theatre was built. National Theatre in Igomu, Lagos was built by the Russians. And then you remember that the Ajokuta Steel Plant, the Delta Steel Plant in Warri, Alaja was also built by the Russians. So you could see a lot of those, the legacies of that Russian-Nigerian relationship in the 70s that was fostered by Muritala Mohammed. So because of the Western Bloc was promoting apartheid in South Africa then. And then the African continent was saying, we don't want apartheid in Africa, but America and Britain were promoting apartheid. So the Nigeria and some other strong African countries aligned with the Soviet bloc. But we all saw that crumbling in the 80s after Shagari took over. And since then, we have no direction. We African countries are more or less puppets, in the hands of especially in the hands of Britain, in the Berlin Conference of 1885, where Africa was parcellated, where Africa was divided with a pencil, the map of Africa was decimated, where the parts of Africa were given to the French, to the British, to the Belgians, and then to some other people that came around to balkanize Africa. Since then, the independence was just a kind of, we are away physically, but they're also in control. Nigeria, for example, has been in the April Spring of the British. And then, of course, America also have a very strong hand tactics when it concerns Nigerian politics, Nigeria's economy, and everything about Nigeria. You see that our countrymen and women, in fact, the Anglophone countries that were colonized are better than the Francophone countries. The Francophone countries have no central bank of their own. They are even, their central bank is in Paris. So you can see that the policies of African countries are actually geared towards the policies of their past colonial masters. Therefore, when matters like this come up now, it is where the masters, the colonial masters, tell them to say they should vote, that they actually vote for.
Okay.
While African countries that stayed away, we are not too sure of the relation. Some of them have relationship with Russia. Some of them have relationship with China. Remember, China has invested heavily in Africa. And so China must have influenced such again. But instead of making their masters angry, making the colonial masters angry, or making China or Russia angry, what they did was stayed away.
Okay, I'd like to bring let me bring Max on this now quickly. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Now, Andrews has highlighted the fact that some African countries have been compelled to either abstain from the votes or actually vote in favor of it. Now, we see countries like Uganda and Mali who actually have relations with Russia abstaining from the vote. I mean, what do you make of this and this a supposed compelling factor by the European Union to have a vote against Russia or for Russia?
I think African nations would have been better off abstaining from this particular vote or siding with Russia, who has been much maligned, certainly by the Western press, and has been painted as the aggressor, as opposed to the fact that they have merely reacted to continued NATO expansion since the Berlin Wall came down, when it was agreed that NATO would not expand any further to the east. So from my perspective here, it is NATO and the West and the US that are the aggressors here. They have provoked this particular situation. And for African nations to not take this into account, I think is unfortunate. But, you know, we are disunited. We have an African Union organization that unfortunately doesn't represent the interests of Africa. It is a talking shop for the leaders of the various African countries who have shown no interest in uniting to present a united Africa. So, after, 20 years after the AU was set up, we don't even have a roadmap for a constitution for a united Africa. That is all that needs to be said. We are not serious. And while we are not serious, we are being picked off one by one. And if we are not very careful, in the very near future, we will find ourselves to be second-class citizens and slaves in our own land. This is where the world is going to. And our leaders seem to be oblivious to the moves that are being made by other countries who have identified their long-term goals and objectives and are pushing towards them. And we just sit here and react with no forward planning or no analysis of the threats that we face, the opportunities that we have, and what we need to do to marshal our people towards, on the march for greater prosperity and independence. Definitely
a lot that the African Union needs to do. Unfortunately, we'll have to cut this conversation here, but we can also continue on social media. Thank you so much, Ambrose Igboke, for joining us on this conversation, and of course, Max Vardon for joining us on this conversation. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.